Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, especially to our live audience. And then, of course, hello for whatever time it is for those of you who are joining us later in the recordings. You are so appreciated by Book Passage and our authors today. Welcome to another edition of Conversations with Authors. I'm your host, Paula Farmer. Anytime we have an opportunity to uplift the exploration of refugee challenges, experience, and triumphs, we are happy to do so and include it in our Conversations with Authors programming. And today, and it's a great way to also support our programming for social justice. Today, this is one such event, and I'm so happy to be part of it. Our featured book, American Refuge, featured behind me, is an intimate and eye-opening book. Diya Abdo is a daughter of refugees, U.S. immigrant, English professor, and activist. She shares the stories in her book of 7 refugees coming from around the world. They're welcomed by Every Campus A Refugee, ECAR, which we'll get more into in the discussion. It's an organization Diya founded to leverage existing resources at colleges to provide temporary shelter to refugee families. Dr. Diya Abdo is a second-generation Palestinian refugee born and raised in Jordan. Her teaching, research, and scholarship focuses on Arab women writers and Arab and Islamic feminism with particular interest in Arab women writers' narrative strategies. She has also published poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction. So very talented, very generous woman. We are so grateful to have her. Joining her in conversation, shepherding the conversation, is her friend and an equally talented writer. Mylene Dressler is the critically acclaimed writer and author of 6 novels, as well as short stories, memoir, and essays. Her work has appeared in the Kenyan Review, Literary Hub, and Washington Post, among many others. She is professor at Guilford College and lives and writes on the Oregon coast and in the Canyon country of southern Utah. With that, I'm going to give it to her very capable hands. Thank you for coming.
Thanks to everyone, yes, and thanks to you, Paula, so much for the introduction, and to Book Passage for hosting this event. And thank you to you all, again, whether you're joining us live or watching later on. I'm so excited that you can be here with me for a conversation with the amazing Diya Abdo. Diya, thank you so much for taking time out of what I know is your busy and hectic life to talk about this beautiful and important, those are the 2 words that come to me when I think of this book, this beautiful and important book called American Refuge. Hi, Diya.
I am. It's lovely to be with you here. Thank you, Paula, and thank you to Book Passage for bringing us together. Em and I haven't seen each other in a while, and so this is a beautiful way to spend time together with all of you.
Yes, absolutely. And I thought I would actually start there, Diya, by talking a little bit about our friendship and what I know of your work, and using that as a way into this book. We have known each other now for over a decade. We are closing in on a dozen years of friendship. And I've known you, of course, as a colleague at Guilford College. I've known you as a brilliant teacher, a professor, a scholar of the highest order. Again, as Paula has mentioned, moving across various fields. I have known you as an activist, an advocate, a thought leader in the area of refugee resettlement, of course, and as the founder of Every Campus A Refuge. And we're definitely going to talk more about ECAR. And I have known you as a writer, as Paula also mentioned, across multiple genres. Fiction, creative nonfiction, poetry. I feel really blessed and really fortunate, my friend, to have been a witness to at least part of the journey that led you to writing this book. And every book I know myself as a writer is a journey, right? It's a journey itself in terms of writing the book. It's also interesting in this case because this book is filled with journeys itself. but there's a part of coming to a book and writing a book that is a private journey. In other words, that can't easily be witnessed, I think, from the outside, even by a loving friend. And so I'm curious if we could just start by, if you could share with us a bit of your journey in coming to write American Refuge.
Sure. So let me start, because I think the journey begins obviously before the book was ever conceived, with Every Campus A Refuge. And so I'll talk a little bit about that because that's an important piece of this. And I do want to uplift again what Paula said about my background, that I'm Palestinian, born and raised in Jordan, the daughter of Palestinian refugees and the granddaughter of Palestinian refugees, and grew up very much on listening to their journey and listening to their experience of not belonging, their experience of yearning, of loss, even though they just moved across the river to a country that, you know, spoke the same language and had similar food, and yet they felt so out of place. And so that was certainly very formative for me to grow up on those stories of my grandmother as she put me to bed at night, of how beautiful Palestine was and how much she longed to go back. And so, you know, I carried that with me, obviously, when I came to the US as a graduate student. And then later, when the refugee crisis erupted for many of us, I mean, you know, as I say elsewhere in the book, there is no singular refugee crisis. There's been refugees as long as there's been people, you know, people seeking safety and security. That's a sort of a fundamental human experience. That's a fundamental human journey, to seek safety for yourself and for your family. But like all of us, I'm sure, who are on this call and you know, others, there's that moment in 2015 when we saw a picture of a small boy, Aylan Kurdi, who drowned. And his picture, now we say went viral, right? But at the time, it spread like wildfire in ways that other images of misery of refugees had not. And it moved the world in ways that other statistics and images of refugees had not. And Pope Francis called on every European parish to host a refugee family. And I was really struck by that call on small communities to do the work of hospitality. And that's when I came up with Every Campus A Refuge, that colleges and universities should absolutely heed that call to take in refugee families, to provide them with support, with welcome, with inclusion, and certainly with resources. And so we can talk later about Every Campus A Refuge. I just wanted to give a little bit of sort of what happened to me in my life. I was really an English professor minding my business. Like you, we're going to class, we're teaching books, we're hoping students have read those books, and we're diving into ideas and hoping that deep dive means something for them 3 years from now. And when that happened in 2015, I wanted something to happen now. I didn't want it to happen 3 years from now. And so we acted very quickly on Guilford's campus. I went to the president, I said, I need a house. Mylene said, let's do it. And everybody was on board, and we found a house, and we've been hosting families ever since. And so I was, you know, since then really involved in refugee resettlement and refugee support issues in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is a refugee resettlement hub. And 2 years ago, in the midst of the pandemic, a publisher reached out to me. So this doesn't happen in the writing world. And they said, look, we've got this series called Truth to Power. And it's about controversial issues that need to be heard, but grounded in narrative and in story, not in argument. And we've looked around for someone who could write about the refugee issue. And we found you. Would you be interested in writing that book? And of course I was. That book was percolating in my head. And I had known stories because we were hosting refugees on Guilford's campus. I got to know them intimately. And so I could have written that book very quickly, but I really wanted to do it in ways that grounded their dignity and their agency. And so I approached some of the folks that I knew and whose stories that I knew, including my own mother, and told them that I would like to interview them officially for publication, because I wanted them to share what they wanted to share and not share what they didn't want to share. And so the first part of the book was really just these interviews, these extensive interviews with folks in English and in Arabic. And then listening through those interviews to create this puzzle, because I didn't want to write a book that just talked about Blaze and then talked about Chaps. And then I wanted to create a book that had a very particular structure that had us walk the journey with all of these individuals from the life before to the life after resettlement. And so it really was a lot of fun for me to listen to the stories and sort of pick them apart to know where to put what. I'd stayed true to the experiences. And hopefully what I stayed true to also was the cadence and the style of the voice. So, you know, when Marwa says something in her very special Iraqi dialect, I tried to capture that as much as possible. When Chep said something in his particular way of speaking, I tried to capture that as much as possible. I myself am a native Arabic speaker, and I really appreciate writers who infuse their native language into English. It really sort of reverses the impact that English has, and it's a really beautiful way of defamiliarizing the English language for readers in ways that sort of like, oh, something different is happening here in this sentence. What is this? And yeah, so it took me some time to go through those interviews. As I expected, folks said, I'm going to tell you this, but I don't want you to share it. And it was really wonderful to know that they trusted me enough to know that I would not share certain details that they had told me before and that they were telling me again, but didn't want people to know. And I also knew that I wanted to write a book that would be really useful in classrooms. So not a book that was hopefully a great read for people who wanted to know about refugee resettlement, but also a good read and a great read, hopefully, for people who knew enough about refugee resettlement, but wanted to ground their knowledge in personal and lived experience. And I also wanted to write a book that was as education and informative as possible through story. So you'll learn a lot about refugees and refugee, you know, the definitions and the history and the policies, but it is all of it really framed around these personal lived experiences. I hope that answers your question about the journey.
Yes, well, it does.
But it happened very quickly, the writing.
Yes. Yeah. It does, and it leads beautifully into something that I want to foreground and that you kind of rushed rather quickly through there. But again, the idea that this book is educational and informative and useful and important. But the other thing, Diya, about the book, and I told you this the first time I read it, and I've actually read it several times now, is that it's also, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, it's a beautiful book. And I think that's something that perhaps some people, even though you have said, hey, this is being picked up by a press that is interested in storytelling and narrative, I think until you actually pick up American Refuge and you start reading it, you really don't understand how absolutely evocative and moving the book is. It's a riveting read, Diya, and I don't use that word lightly. We live in a time, you're talking about stories and storytelling. We live in a time right now where there's a great deal of story that we have access to, right, in different forms and platforms and formats. And so there's a lot of good storytelling out there. So honestly, for me, it takes kind of more than it used to, right? So for me to say something is riveting, right? Really arrests me and freezes me in place and holds my attention. And this book does that. And it's partly, I think, because of what you're describing, the quality of voice, your voice, as well as the voices that you are channeling and translating. But it's also a feature, I think, of the language itself that you are wielding, that you are using to tell these stories. And I remember when I first talked to you about this book, that was one of the first things I said to you, was like, I'm amazed at how you are able to wield the language so powerfully and poetically, and yet still the language is in service to the subject, to what you are talking about, rather than the language drawing attention to itself, which is a really tricky thing to do. We can acknowledge, since we're both writers, right, to write something that's beautiful and evocative and moving, but doesn't make the reader notice, oh, look at this great flowery language, right? It really always is in service to its project. And this book is filled with powerful and poetic and at times painful and searing language, as it has to be, and other moments that are just elevating and soulful. I'm going to say that word quite deliberately. And what it has, Diya, and I don't think I've shared this with you before, there are elements of the language that, yes, are moving, and we could even say entertaining, if you want to. You talk about wanting to make it a great read, and it is. But the combination of that and the fact that it is instructive, In other words, that this had to be what you were hoping for, right? That this language would be moving, people would want to read, they would want to turn the page, but as you're going along, it's sinking into you. It's instructive, evocative language. And that was my experience of reading the book. And I just want to give one example of that and then ask you a bit more about this. But for example, very near the beginning, at the beginning of the book, you describe the experience of the refugee, of becoming a refugee, being a refugee, as the experience of being separated from your soul, being separated from one's soul, the soul actually leaving the body and the body traveling on as if without it, as if emptied, or in your phrase, tightened for travel. And that image has just haunted me, and in the best possible way, and has transformed my understanding. And brought me closer to the experience of what it means to be a refugee. The language, again, just the sound of it, that, separated from one's soul, but also what it means. And I need to let you jump in here, but just so you can hear what I pulled out of it. Certainly refugees lose house and home and community and neighborhood and family, land and job and national identity. But those seems like sort of just words. I think that it's really easy to just hear and go, but it's so much, it's all of that and more, right? It really is the experience of being sundered, right? Of something being torn and ripped. It is the experience of the soul being left behind. And so I wanted to ask you about that phrase and maybe more generally about that kind of language. Is that language that you found emerged through the process of interviewing, or that you had to discover, almost invent for yourself in order to make this book resonate in the way that you wanted it to?
Thank you. And I'm happy to read that portion if you
Please
think
do.
that, yeah, wonderful. And I will say that it is actually from an Arabic expression. And so my grandmother, who I loved very much and who raised me, and who really is in many ways my North Star when I think about the refugee experience and the resilience of refugees and the desire for return that does not get met. The body her body gave up, right? And she died in Jordan, having never returned. When I went to the US as a graduate student and sort of left her behind, she said, "Akhadti ruhi ma'aki," you took my soul with you. And she meant it, right? I mean, family, kin is everything, especially, I mean, in all communities, but especially for her, who had left so many family members behind. When you're a member of the diaspora and you feel pieces of your soul being torn away, she saw grandchildren and children just scattered all over the world. It was a continual severance, right? Like to be constantly severed from your soul. It was, as you say, a constant tearing apart. So I'll read maybe that first section. Human bodies on the move don't always take their souls with them. Sometimes they leave their souls behind, lay them down before they gather their disparate selves and strike out on planes or cars or inflatable boats or foot to cross borders they must cross to keep themselves and their children safe. If they are lucky, their souls might come to find them, reuniting with them across vast distances. But it is an exhausted union. The body has left the soul for a long time, and their union is a shadow of its former joy. Often, refugees spend the rest of their lives yearning for that which they have had to leave behind: love, family members, a land bountiful and once theirs, homes that brought them together before fracturing them into the corners of the earth. When refugees leave, it is rarely, if ever, happy, and it is never something they choose to do. Their bodies, finding no other way to survive, split themselves from their souls, wave them goodbye on the fragile hope that soon they will meet again. And I think this answers actually a question that came in the chat, which is, what's the difference between a refugee and documented an immigrant? A refugee is a very specific status. It's a legal status. Of course, refugees existed well before that designation, which came about during the Geneva Convention in 1951 on the heels of World War II, when there were many refugees. But a refugee is a very particular legal status that enables someone to be resettled. And to prove your case as a refugee, you have to seek asylum in the second country that you've escaped to. And you have to have one of 5 reasons. Climate is not one of them. Neither is economic devastation. So it really is related to persecution, based on ethnicity, on race, on political belief, on religion. So it's not about things that we really think, you know, should absolutely be grounds for asylum. So a refugee is someone who has asylum case, or her asylum case has been heard, and they've been designated as a refugee. They enter the US, just for clarity, legally. I use the term because I define all of these things in the book, and I talk about the racialization and politicization of these terms, you know, refugee, undocumented immigrant. An immigrant is someone who moves. All of these are people who move, right? They have to move, they need to move because they're looking for something, whether it's security or safety or opportunity or companionship or love or home or whatever it is, they need to move. And moving is a human right, movement is a human right. But immigrants might move and by choice. Refugees do not move by choice. So I'm an immigrant. I came to the US as an immigrant in pursuit of a graduate education. My parents and grandparents moved to Jordan by force. They did not choose to move to Jordan. They were forced to leave their country. An undocumented person, again, that's a very political term. I talk in the book about the term itself. It's bizarre. What does it mean to be documented and undocumented? Everybody's birth has been documented in some way. Someone has witnessed your coming into the world and has marked it somewhere, somehow. And if you think about history, for all, you know, until the last century, you could cross and go anywhere and nobody asked for your papers, right? When the Puritans landed here, nobody said, hey, where are your documents? Are you here legally? So it really is a sort of a modern invention based on borders and the creations of borders. But undocumented really means now in the current political context, it's someone who has entered a country without a specific kind of visa. And so technically they don't have documentation that allows them to be here. Refugees do have specific documentation that allows them to enter this country and to become residents, and it's a pathway to citizenship. That's a very important marker in the refugee resettlement story here in this country, that refugees have a very definable pathway to citizenship. They become citizens after 5 years if they apply for the necessary paperwork.
That was really helpful, Diya. And it also, and just for folks who have not read the book yet, yes, Diya includes all of these definitions, but it's the way that you structure everything in the book that I think works so powerfully and effectively. Those definitions, interestingly, it's a glossary, but it isn't, right? It's so much more than that. It actually comes at the end of the book, right? And I think it would have been an easy temptation to put that at the beginning of the book, but the way that you structure the book so that we understand the rending of soul away from body, that we understand the before stories, what happens, what people, who they are before they receive this designation of refugee, and then the stories of what happens during that process and what happens after arrival, prepares you to understand the definitions that you come at the end in a really profound way, so that as you were reading the difference between refugee and immigrant, it's what you just described, but it all again becomes so much more to life, right? Because these are not just empty words or definitions that are stark, right, and unsurrounded by all of the storytelling that has come before. I wanted to build a little bit on, again, something that I heard in there. You said that refugees, of course, have to tell their story, right? There is a story that they have to tell in order to validate themselves, in order to receive this designation of refugee, which will then allow them to move through the processes of resettlement, if they are so fortunate as to have that. One of the things that I learned from this book is that, if I remember correctly, only 1% of refugees are ever resettled. That was one of the many things that shocked me. You think you know a little bit about what happens to refugees as they move through the world. I discovered that I knew very, very little, and that was one that really astonished me. But the other thing I learned, both from the book and more from the book, but initially through my experience as a volunteer, as I briefly was with Every Campus A Refuge, I remember you talk in the book, there's a moment where you talk about how if you ask a refugee, sometimes a very simple general question, out will come this elaborate and detailed narrative, a story, right, of what has happened to them. And I remember fairly recently, right before the pandemic, I met a family that had moved into one of the houses on campus. And I asked a very general question, You know, how are you feeling? How are you settling in? Just a general question. And out came, much to my surprise, this again, very detailed narrative, this is what has happened to me. And I rather naively at the time, very naively at the time, thought, oh, well, what is happening in this moment is that I have asked a question and someone is experiencing an emotional upwelling, right? And that my job at this moment is to listen as this person unburdens themselves, right, of this emotional upwelling that they need to get out. And of course, from your book and from later experience, I've heard that that is not necessarily what's happening at that moment. And it's not to suggest that it's not an intimate moment and a human to human moment, but there is a context for that behind it. And I was hoping you could share with us a bit more about that, about the origin story, as you call it in the book.
Sure. Yeah. And I think this is one of the biggest myths about refugees, of course, that's been touted quite frequently in the last few years, which is that refugees are not well vetted. How do we know that the refugees that we're getting here are not terrorists? They are the most well-vetted population on the planet. They have to go through many tests, many interviews. Indeed, I would call them interrogations by multiple agencies. So once a refugee presents themselves to the second country, like they've escaped Uganda and now they're in Kenya, or they've escaped Syria and now they're in Jordan, the police will meet you, the army, and then you tell your story. And then that story has to stay the same story every time the resettlement agency interviews you, the UNHCR interviews you, the US Embassy interviews you. So every agency demands their pound of flesh, and the story cannot change. And so refugees learn that they have to be very specific with their stories, that there is this origin story that validates their refugee status and that really, in a way, calls them into being as a refugee. And it's incredibly traumatizing because you're not allowed to forget it. One of the people in the book that I talk about is Blaze, whose case took 17 years. And he had to constantly remember that story as a child. He was 13 years old. And imagine the sort of the triggers then, right? When someone says, how are you doing? And they're experiencing me and you, Mylene, as benefactors, right? So when we say, how are you doing? It really is not simple. It's not easy. It's not transparent. It's not innocent. It's, oh, I'm a guest here. I need to again prove myself. And so I'll read, if you don't mind, a couple of sections that really speak to some of the challenges. When I started working with refugees in 2016, I had not known about this particular requirement, the repeated screening interviews, which necessitate the repeated, unchanging, identical narration of the origin story of why one became a refugee. When we hosted our first Syrian family on Guildford College's campus, I went in those early days of our friendship to visit them. I sat down for tea with the mother, Fehmi, in their spacious living room facing the woods. I had come casually in the way of Arabs, and I can't remember what I asked. It was a simple question, polite, harmless, something like, how are you doing? Kif halik? I know now that questions about one's being when asked of a refugee are never simple. Their experiences have taught them that such questions are a test upon which their very futures, their very safety, their very being, about which I was seemingly harmlessly asking, depends. How are you doing? Fehmi's answer came quickly, easily, and at length. A perfect, flawless, rehearsed, and deeply painful and intimate origin story. The beautiful building in Homs, the plans for more levels on top for the other sons about to get married, then the darkness, the neighbors slaughtered, including the toddlers and the infants, their throats slit, the fear that it was the other neighbors who had done it. She had recognized his voice under the mask when he came around that day, threatening. He used to come over for tea in the before days, unmasked and gunless. Then a gas canister exploded in the house. She came out, blackened, and unthinkingly cursed Bashar. The neighbor heard her. She tried to cover up what she said, but knew their days were numbered. The next day, 40 men came, masked, and threatened to kill her entire family. They tried to take her youngest son, Tamir, then 10, because they said he had been at a protest against Bashar. Under the cover of night, they gathered themselves, so many of them, all the sons, all the daughters, all their husbands and wives and children, and fled. Along the way, a very long journey, they were almost run off the roads by highway bandits, hid in a bombed out building, nearly lost a baby when in the chaos of an explosion, everybody scattered and her daughter gave her granddaughter quickly to someone else. They found the baby the next day, taken care of, but many other children, the children and grandchildren of others, including her own siblings' children and grandchildren, were not so lucky. At the end of her recitation, she kept saying that while it was hard, they made it with their honor intact. So many women had been raped. They had narrowly escaped that and were so proud and grateful that they had. What we have tasted, no one has tasted, she told me. I'd like to read another section, Mylene, because this is about a time when it doesn't work, telling your confession.
Okay.
And this is a story that Cheps told me. Cheps is from Uganda, and he was actually the first guest hosted on our campus in LGBTQ case. And this is from Cheps. When Cheps eventually reached Nairobi, he had to tell his story to the UN official. In those interviews, Cheps's grandmother's lessons worked. He looked to his words, knew what to say, watched them as they came out of his mouth. Earlier we hear, because we begin with these people in their home countries that they loved. And so we learn about his grandmother and the lessons that she taught him. The people who interviewed him were strangers to his soul. Within 4 years, his case was processed. 3 of them were spent in Kakuma, 1 in Nairobi. His roommate, Marcel, however, remains in Kakuma 8 years later. Marcel asks friends who have resettled for the money he needs to buy some water cans and some seeds to plant his garden in the camp. He stayed behind because he did not know how to defend himself in those interviews. In the boat with that lion, he was the goat. In the interviews, when they asked Cheps about his private life, prodding him to prove his case, he bit down on his dignity, clamped it down so that he could tell them what was painful, shameful, hard for him to say. Where was the whistle now when the words too hard to say, where he can simply breathe out his response to their call? For others like Marcel, who is elderly and interrogated by a young woman asking questions about his most private life, it is hard to set down one's story, to answer the probing, direct questions, to lay oneself bare before a stranger to one's soul. Marcel goes back again and again, hoping, waiting, wishing that the next time he goes, the interviewer will be older, with gray hair like him, and maybe, just maybe, a member of the LGBTQ community with whom he can use the whistle instead of the words that catch in his throat and refuse to come out.
And again, I must point out again, and there again is some of that incredibly beautiful language that is translating the story to us in a way that resonates. And it's just incredible, Diya, how you do this. And I know I got to meet Cheps, I remember as well, and work with Cheps a little bit. And you do discuss as well that not only are the stories come out in different ways or in different contexts, that it isn't always an automatic recitation of an origin story, particularly in the moments that you describe, but also for some refugees like Cheps as a gay man, right? The telling is fraught no matter where, in other words, just coming to America doesn't even solve that telling, right? And so there is this constant, I'm wondering if it would be fair to say, Diya, that in some ways, and some ways not, it's as if story is taken from you as a refugee. In other words, the very idea of story or your freedom, right, to frame a story in the way that you want to is another thing that is kind of torn away. And yet at the same time, your book is so wonderful, again, in those sections where it deals with the before, right, before they become a refugee, the stories that they inherit and the stories that they learn from and the stories that they keep and that they do manage to carry with them. And one of those was, for me, Chet's story, the things that he learned from, I believe, his grandmother, yes, about if you cross a river, you mentioned it briefly, but if you cross a river with 3 things, right? If you need to cross a river with a goat and a lion and sweet potato leaves, yeah, you must be careful about which 2, yeah, right?
Yeah.
And that this story actually, if I remember correctly, helps him. In other words, there is a quality of story that is preserved, right, and is carried. The soul is lost, but there is much that is still contained, right, within the body that does make the journey across. And so the book American Refuge, again, in ways that were unexpected to me, even knowing you, is so layered in terms of its thinking about story, right, and storytelling. You also, I wanted to know if you'd like to talk a little bit more about the myths, because there are so many of them that even those of us who feel halfway informed might be carrying around with us. Some of them are, again, this idea that if you're a refugee, you come from a shithole country, which is language that was graciously given to us by the last administration, the last president. But I think was already in the discourse, right? We already had this idea that you must be leaving some just awful, awful place. And yet your book makes clear that these are incredibly rich and vibrant communities that were, and in some places still are, if you're like, but you were forced to leave. Again, you mentioned earlier that refugees do not leave by choice. I think that's a myth that a lot of us might carry around, that there's sort of, you could have stayed, you are forced. This is forced migration. You've discussed already about the myth that refugees are not vetted. And again, the last administration, it's not limited to them. Our country is full of discourses of hordes at the border, right? Hordes at the border that are trying to get in. They're dangerous and they're unvetted, and that is simply not the case, as you've made clear, with refugees, or in general, I might add. But the one that I think, and again, this book really rocked my world, Diya, in so many ways. It shook me, it transformed me, it transformed my understanding. I think one of the myths that I carried around, and maybe it's because I'm an immigrant and not a refugee, is this idea that, but if you can just get here, right? If you can just get here, all that trauma, but if you can just get here, you've won the lottery. Now, literally in some ways you have, right? Because the chances of getting picked are slim. But I don't mean it in that way. I mean that once you get here, it's like you've won the lottery. Somehow you made it to America, and it is going to be rough, and the transition will be hard, but ultimately your experience here will be one of safety and security, maybe even gratitude and happiness and contentment. And you don't let us off the hook as readers learning about the stories of refugees, that this is not necessarily, and in fact, quite not often not the case, that you do not come here, achieve a modicum of safety and security, and suddenly, you relax, and contentment is eventual and will ensue. In fact, what I remember from the book, and again, another thing that stayed with me, is that many families that come, the parents, right, that's not, for them, that's not even possible. They may be hoping for their children. Their children will experience a different kind of sense of home in America. But because your soul has been left behind, right, in the way that we started this conversation, this is not necessarily a series of narratives of triumph at the end. And I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So I think that myth that if you can only make it to America, you will be happy. Yes, you might be safe, but a lot of refugees, first of all, they're traumatized, right? There's the trauma of the conflict itself that causes one to be a refugee. And then there's the trauma of living in a refugee camp. As you said, one of the myths that I try to bust here is that resettlement is a given. It's not. There are 86 million displaced people in the world. 28 million of them are designated refugees. Less than 1% of that will ever resettle. So 27 million people will live in refugee camps, and their children will live in refugee camps for generations. And so that 1%, as you say, they have in a way been very lucky, and they know that they are very lucky because now there's a pathway to citizenship. That's the important piece. They're no longer stateless. They can work, they can live, they can give their children a future. That's, as you say, what they care about. But then, the trauma of the conflict, the trauma of living in a refugee camp, urban and rural refugee camps are incredibly challenging spaces, as you can imagine. You are stateless, you don't have access to rights, you don't have access to resources. The trauma of the journey to the US, many refugees, when they arrive, tell us they have no idea where they're coming. They don't know what it's going to be like when they get here. In fact, Fehmi, when she first saw us at the airport, cried. And I thought she cried because she was sad, but actually she cried because she was relieved that there were people greeting her at the airport. She had no idea what was going to be at the end of that plane ride from Jordan. And then, of course, the myth that when refugees come, they get a lot of resources. I want to tell you right now that refugees, each individual gets $1,000 one-time stipend. That's it. That's all they get. They have come here to this country with nothing. Sometimes it's not even a bag of luggage. Sometimes it's just a plastic bag with things in it. So they get 1,000 per person, and they are expected to become self-sufficient within 90 days. So within 90 days of arrival, that $1,000 is supposed to get them through rent, food, furniture, and then get a job. They also have to pay the plane ticket that brings them to this country. So if you're a family of 11, that's about $13,000 that you already owe the resettlement agency. So you've already incurred debt upon arrival. And then because of this expectation for self-sufficiency, people have to take the first job that they're offered, which more often than not does not really coincide with their skills, their expertise. To give you a very vivid example of that, here's the book. This actually, the book, this is the designer of the book, is one of the guests that we hosted on our campus, Ali Al-Khazraji. And Ali is an Iraqi activist, artist and calligraphist. And of course, this is Lady Liberty, and the red in there says refugee in Arabic. So it's an Arabic sort of calligraphic representation of that word. Ali is a very talented artist. He was, there were 2 attempts on his life, 2 assassination attempts, because he had marginally, tangentially worked with an American company in Iraq. He did typesetting for them and was targeted with a bomb and then a gun attack. And so brought his family here to this country because he wanted to be safe and he wanted them to be safe. But Ali is not working in his guild. He's cutting chicken at Tyson. And there's I think for me, one of the most moving chapters is describing his job on the line. I mean, he's using his right arm to cut. He's actually, no, he's left-handed. He's using his left, and it's atrophying. I mean, it's constantly in pain because it's this motion of, he has to cut 38 chicken breasts a minute and to do this calligraphy work on the side. Of course, our campus, in addition to providing support, we provide a lot of other opportunities. So he actually does work by commission that's supported by our organization and is able to make additional money that has now enabled them to buy a house, which is wonderful. So now they own a home, which is a great achievement, especially these days. But there's also beyond the financial instability and the sort of lack of resources, there's the depression and the homesickness. Yeah, they have left their souls behind. And I want to read that, to go back to Fehmi, that section about Fehmi. She's now in Buffalo. They've been here for 6 years. She's become a US citizen. In fact, Ali's citizenship exam is in 2 weeks. So wish him luck. Chaps has become a US citizen, and they're of course very excited about that and what that means for them and for their families. But they, there are moments of sadness, of course. And it's really important to remember that like all of us, they are people who love their homes, miss their homes, want to be in their homes, and that being in this country is not necessarily sort of the solution to all of their traumas. Fehmi lives in Buffalo. Like Jennifer's family, who moved from North Carolina to Tennessee, Fehmi and her family left the state to which they first arrived. Called secondary resettlement, this happens because refugees often cannot find the opportunities they hoped for, needed in the location of primary resettlement. Will our migration ever end? Fehmi asks me. Her son, Noor, the only one of her older children who was able to join her from Jordan, works as an Uber driver at night. During the day, he sleeps, his depression getting the better of him. Because all of her other children were over the age of 18, their cases were processed separately, and her other 2 sons and 4 daughters are still stuck in Madaba, waiting on the Refugee Resettlement Agency to call them, to tell them their time has come to also join their mother and father. In the meantime, they use dwindling food coupons to pay for rent and work odd jobs whenever they can. Their own children do not go to school and have forgotten how to write their own names. Fehmi swears to me that she would never have left her children behind in Jordan had she not needed to leave for 2 important reasons: her youngest son Tamer's future and her own health. In Jordan, Tamer was missing out on an education, and she wanted something better for him, a life of choice and opportunity. And her own body was failing her. She needed surgeries and medications none of which she could access living as a refugee in Madaba. Now she has access to the medical support she needs, and Tamer has just started college. But even though she has only seen comfort in the US, her soul is sick. The sight of police officers carrying weapons terrifies her, ties her tongue, paralyzes her body. All she can see in them are those men who broke into her house in Homs, masked, guns drawn, pulling away her son, threatening to kill the entire family as they had done the neighbors. And then there's the guilt that eats away at her. When her son Noor forces her to go out, to gaze upon her Lord's face in the beautiful streets and the water, all she can do is look at the beauty and wonder about what right she has to be here, to be watching the ships roll majestically into the harbor when her oldest son, Fihmi, is too depressed to leave his own home, even during Eid. He's too embarrassed to greet his nieces and nephews and not be able to put his hand in his pocket in the customary way and pull out the adiyah, the money that tells them that he is their uncle and that Eid is a time of joy and plenty. Instead, he sits at home in Madaba, disappearing into the size of a twig. His wife, Hazar's mother, left him and their children. She could no longer handle their poverty, no longer watch their children starve. In Jordan, there are not enough jobs for Jordanians, let alone Syrians. Fehmi and Noor send what they can to their family back in Madaba, but she and her husband are too old and too sick to work, and Noor makes just enough to survive and care for his own wife and 3 children. She is in her 6th year without them, well, now the 7th. In the home country, they all lived in the same building, each son and daughter on a different floor. She's in Buffalo, watching the ships roll into the harbor, and her children are living their own death, a rented life of fainting bodies under falling roofs, thousands of miles away in an ancient city with an old mosaic map. I have put my eye in God's eye, for I have nothing in my hands. It is all out of my control.
I'm thinking.
I think we're back. Are you good?
Yeah, there was a little strangeness there. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know I'm thinking as a writer now, and of course the temptation I think always is we are aware that audiences like happy endings, you know, and so the way that this book very, very directly, very specifically paints a real picture, right, of what cannot be erased, of what is lost, without erasing also what might be possible and what could be to come, is a really important, I think, aspect of this book. And so the book really becomes not about, oh, let me just watch the trials and tribulations of a refugee and know that they came to a happy place and now I don't have to think about it anymore, right? It's not that narrative arc at all. Instead, where the book really leaves us, not only with definitions that are more fully rounded now because of the experiences of these stories that you have shared and translated for us, but it also leaves us with the idea of radical hospitality, right? And what we can do with radical hospitality. And I don't know if you've noticed, but over in the chat, the majority of the questions really are about what can we do, right? And that is as you said, the refugee crisis is ongoing. It never stops, right? And so that is really where the narrative always has to go next, right? Which is what can we do? And so Cynthia is asking particularly about Texas, you know, and Paul is asking about other countries. There are places where it seems to be even harder, right, to help refugees. And Jake is asking, what can we do? What can we do, large or small, to help refugees? As you help us understand that we need to embrace a radical hospitality, a fullness of welcome. How can we do what our listeners here are asking us to do? What can we do to move that part of the narrative forward?
Thank you. And I love the question, big and small, because that really is truly what it comes down to. When we engage with refugees and talk about their experiences, it's the small things that stick with them. Somebody came over for tea, or somebody brought over a mask during the pandemic, or someone showed them how to use the bus in this new city that they find themselves in. And so it's really the small ways that support this sense of welcome and belonging. and inclusion, right? When we talk about refugees, we like to talk about integration and inclusion, right? So that we're all together in this community and we all we feel like we belong to each other. For me, it's also thinking innovatively about resources and leveraging resources that are there and yet, you know, potentially maybe nobody's using them, or maybe they're sitting unused for a while. That's where, for me, Every Campus A Refuge can really shine, because it imagines how colleges and universities across this country, in their vast resources, they're incredibly resource rich, whether it's in housing or human resources or facilities, how those can be leveraged to support community members who don't have access to those resources and can certainly use access to these resources. And we are better for giving them access because they become parts of our community, and we learn so much about the diversity in our community by welcoming them into our spaces. And so when we host refugees on Guilford College's campus, the first thing that they ask for is Wi-Fi, because they want to connect with their families back home, right? They want to tell them, I'm here and it's okay. And so it's something we take for granted, right? But being able to say, you're on a college campus, you can log on to this Wi-Fi and connect with your family. When we hosted 16 Afghan evacuees this year, the second thing they asked for was the gym. And that's something that we have on a college campus that folks can use. And so thinking about the resources that you might have at your disposal and what you can offer to someone and to a family or to a person and say, I have this thing, please use it. Or can I help you figure out how to use the bus? Or conversation partners or tutoring, or again, as small as just having tea with someone. But we all have access to something that can be used by another human being to make their lives here easier. And so I would really encourage you to think about it locally. Every Campus A Refuge is incredibly hyper-local. And so think about your community. Connect with your refugee resettlement agency and ask them whether you can volunteer or not. Connect with your community-based organizations that support refugees and ask them, maybe they need some materials, maybe they need help over the summer with childcare, maybe they need some resources to be able to provide, EL tutoring for the families that they serve. And advocate, talk to people about refugees. I would say from my experience that people don't like refugees because they don't know refugees. Once you meet them, just like anything else, once you have a conversation with someone, then you realize we're all really just humans and we all want the same things and we all love our children and we want the best for our children. One of my most powerful moments was when a facilities person at Guilford College, who is from North Carolina, a lovely man, but had never met refugees before, and would go into the house to fix the washing machine when it needed fixing, and came to my office one day and said, I really want to thank you because I went over to their house and the kids came out and he said, and they're just like me. And I thought, exactly, that's exactly it. And so creating opportunities for just one-on-one interaction and one-on-one conversations is a huge deal. It makes all the difference for how we understand what it means to have this human experience that is incredibly painful and really it just requires from us to listen and to support sometimes. And if there's a resource that we can share, then I encourage you to do that.
Diya, can you still hear me?
I can. Can
Good.
you hear me?
Yes, I can. My screen has frozen, but I can still hear you and see you. Thank you so much for all of that. The one thing that also I remember from the book is that you do remind us, in addition to this is shared humanity, right? These are not others, right? We are all connected. You do also remind us that anyone can become a refugee, that refugees do not start out knowing that this is going to happen to them, or that this is a moniker that will be attached to them, or that this is it is an upheaval that can happen across the human spectrum and across the world. And so I think that's something, again, one of those moments in the book that, again, sort of the ground moved underneath my feet when I understood that, when I understand that not only am I reaching into and trying to understand what has happened to these particular people, but there is no reason for me to hold this at arm's length, right? Or to imagine, right, that it could not happen, and that it does not happen unpredictably all around the world. And that we know that the climate crisis is going to create climate refugees. Wars are unpredictable, they create refugees. This is a book that really seeks to bind us together by specifically understanding the stories of these 7 individuals, as well as your own beautiful story, I might add. but also it makes it pretty difficult for you to, again, keep that, hold that over here and say, well, this is something that happens over there. And so you fold us in, you draw us in that way as well, with that reminder, with that directness, with the beautiful language in the book and the incredible sensitivity and care and integrity. And you use the word dignity, Diya, with which you have brought these stories to us. It looks like we're winding down on the hour. I'm just looking over here to see if there are any other, let's give folks just a minute. If anyone's left and wants to ask a question, we'll see if one more pops up. And while we're waiting, again, I'm going to hold the book up. I'm so glad. Oh, I don't know if you can see it because I can't see anything on my end. But it's an incredible book, Diya. Again, powerful, beautiful, necessary is the word that keeps coming to mind to me. Also, a necessary book that is an incredibly rich and rewarding read and gives us so much. And I, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for the generosity, really, for all of the years. I mean, you say, oh, well, a publisher contacted me and I began writing this book, but really all of the years of generosity, even before that offer came along, all of the obviously incredible patience and work that it took to hear these stories and to translate them and to give them to us with such integrity. Thank you so much for that, Diya. And by the way, just so you know, the book rewards rereading as well. There's so much in it that I'm now on my third reading. And again, like all great writing, gleaning more and more from it every time.
Thank you. And if I need to take you with me everywhere. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, if folks are on this call and you are connected to a college or university, Every Campus A Refuge is a national effort. We have campuses all over the country who are heeding this call for generosity, for radical hospitality. If you're connected to a campus, please reach out, and I'm happy to support you becoming an Every Campus A Refuge.
Mm-hmm. And you can certainly go to the Every Campus A Refuge website as a great place to start. ECAR for short, Every Campus A Refuge. Please go there to learn more about this incredible organization that is growing by leaps and bounds and will in many ways answer some of the final questions that we have, give you opportunities to create a better narrative going forward for refugees. Paula, I think it's time to hand it over to you as our hour winds down.
I know. And honestly, I was shocked when I looked up at the clock because I was so into it. I was like, I can't believe how quickly that hour flew by. Thank you both. Mylene, your leading of the discussion was superb. Just amazing. And Diya, thank you for putting together this book and these stories. I think what's interesting, as was pointed out during your discussion, as kind of poignant and powerful and beautiful and sometimes painful as the stories are, I've got to say your discussion of them and your explanation and your description, just as much so, if not more so. So I'm hoping you're getting lots of opportunities to uplift this book, uplift these stories, and get these conversations going. And also informative. I mean, it's just very pragmatic and informative as well. So thank you to you both. Thank you for those of you in the audience that joined us for this live or later on. Please do pick up a copy of American Refuge. We have plenty at Book Passage in both locations, San Francisco and Corte Madera. And you can come in safely to either store, or you can give us a call, get an enthused bookseller that will give you multiple copies, or order online. And I think it's important to point out that this was released in paperback. This is a thin, easy, accessible, travel with you paperback. So no excuse not to get it for yourself. Get us gifts, pass it along for students if you have classes. But thank you so much to both of you and for our audience. Until our next presentation. Okay, people are asking for specific ways to contact Mylene and Diya.
Lovely. So you can reach me by email at abdod@guilford.edu. If I put that in the chat, can you put that in the, excellent.
Yes, and I'm also going to put in the chat on my website, which is the easiest way to go and find my email there, author at mdressler.com. And thank you so much for asking the question and for giving us a chance to answer that. And I think I can speak for us both writers. We like to talk about our work. So yeah, so please feel free if you were too shy or there were any questions that you had that didn't come up in time or anything that you would like to know more about, please feel free to reach out to both of us.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, both of you, for the information of the event, but also just the practical information for people to help out or to access you for more information. With that, I'm going to close and remind people to get the book from Book Passage. And also, thank you for joining us until our next event. We'll see ya.